Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting Live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is William Bell, and we're delighted to be with you today. I'm here with Don Preston. Don, are you able to hear me okay?
I am right here, William. Can you hear me this evening?
I can hear you very well, and that's
great.
That's really great compared to what we had on last week. Ladies and gentlemen, we do apologize for that. That was just a fluke that we had. I happened to be traveling and typed in a wrong letter and couldn't look at that because I know I'm not supposed to be texting and driving in the first place. and Don had some technical issues on his end. But anyway, we are here, and we are delighted to be here, to be back, and have a great study for you tonight. So what's happening in your part of the country, Don?
Oh, my goodness, just hectic, super hectic. I want to share that I got a message today on Facebook from Makonnen Tadisi from Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. He, of course, is one of our main contacts over there, and he was very, very excited. He just finished a formal public debate with a gentleman on the millennium, and he said it went extremely well. So he was very, very excited. And William, I don't know if you saw it on TV night before last or not, but that Anthony Bourdain, who has the TV show entitled Parts Unknown, and Anthony Bourdain is a chef, and he travels all around the world, and he tries out the food in all of these different venues. And his program night before last was on Ethiopia and Addis Ababa. So, needless to say, I sit rather enraptured since we are making our plans to go to Ethiopia next year. What was absolutely stunning to me was he revealed that Ethiopia currently has one of the top 15 fastest growing economies in the world, and it is experiencing a cultural revolution there of modernization. And it was stunning to see the camera shots down the street, and on one site you have the erection of a beautiful, beautiful modern skyscraper office complex. Sitting adjacent to it were wooden shanty houses. And it was just stunning. And there were kids playing in the street. And you're just going, wait a minute. Talk about two worlds. Talk about the clash of two cultures almost. But it was quite a fascinating program. I even saw some food on the plates as he was sharing his culinary adventures. I actually saw some food on the plates that looked pretty good. And, William, you know how picky I am. So it was really fascinating.
Well, I expect there to be some pretty delicious food when I go there, Lord willing, and I'm looking forward to it. So,
Absolutely. And, William, before we proceed, but to change topics just a little bit, want to just thank so much all of the people who continue to subscribe to Fulfilled Radio. And, William, I don't know if they contacted you or not, but just this last week, I received an email from a gentleman who was commenting on what we are currently doing. And that is that we are currently examining the presentations given at the Bellevue Church of Christ lectureship earlier this year. And the theme of that lectureship was, of course, responding to or refuting realized eschatology. All of the speakers on the dais there gave what they thought and claimed was a definitive, thoroughgoing refutation of covenant eschatology, when in fact, as we have been revealing and exposing, the presentations are absolutely presuppositional. They are shallow. They show an incredible ignorance of biblical eschatology, and how anyone could claim that what they were saying and teaching down there is a definitive refutation of covenant eschatology is just simply a demonstration that they don't understand the topic at all. But I say all of that to say this. The email that I received was from a gentleman who said that his initial thought was, when he knew that we were going to be doing that, he was just pretty well convinced it was going to be a couple of guys ranting and raving, so to speak, against those esteemed speakers. And yet, after listening to our program over and over, he has begun to realize how solid our presentations really are. He has begun to understand covenant eschatology. And so it's so refreshing and it's so encouraging to receive that email and others like it, by the way, that inform us that what we're doing here, and granted we've been at it for a little while, but it lets us know that we're not just spinning our wheels, that we really are answering objections that are being offered, and people are understanding how futile the efforts of those men on the Bellevue Church of Christ lectureship truly are, and how shallow their presentations truly are. And so I didn't know if you received an email like that or not, William, but I just wanted to share that so that our audience understands the response that we are getting to these programs.
Well, I hate to one-up you.
Okay.
But
well, you just go for it.
I didn't get an email, but I actually had a phone call today. Awesome. With a person in the Church of Christ who I am not going to name,
right?
But who, and I had a pretty extensive conversation with him, called about some Bible verses to get some clarity on some issues, and then we had a discussion on, how each of us came to understand some things about covenant eschatology. But he said when he first started out listening to the Bellevue lectures and our reviews of them, well, actually he said he didn't listen to our reviews. He started out listening only to the Bellevue lectures. And he said after he started listening to them, he said this was supposed to be the cream of the crop.
That's right.
And he said once he started listening to them, he knew that they were in trouble and that there was something more to the scriptures than what they were saying. He said that all they were doing was getting up and basically repeating each other's material and saying the same thing over and over again. And by the way, I listened to the wrong lesson by who are we reviewing tonight? Gene Hill, is it?
Yeah, Gene Hill.
Yeah, I listened to his lesson, and he basically stated that in the lesson that I listened to. I happened to listen to the wrong one. And he said, well, the reason, he said somebody in the audience apparently said, you're preaching, my lesson or something. He said, well, we're supposed to. We're all saying the same thing. So that confirmed what this person told me today. And here's the other point of interest. We've talked about that article that I wrote on To Whom Shall We Go, which I just think was just absolutely genius, right?
It was. Here, let me pat you on the back lest you break your own arm.
There you go. But at any rate, he mentioned that he had studied Franklin Camp's book on the work of the Holy Spirit, like you and I have, and had quoted some statements from Gus Nichols, from Foy Wallace, and from a few others, and said that after looking at that, it just led him directly to covenant eschatology. Mm-hmm. And I pointed out, I said, it's interesting, I said, because Gary Workman, which is one person I quoted in that article, made the statement that if we took Wallace and Wayne Jackson and Franklin Camp, etc., to their logical conclusions, because all of them had positions on 70 AD, and, for example, Guy and Woods and his debate with Ben Franklin, he said if we took those positions that these men held to their logical conclusions, it would lead us to 70 AD. So here we are, as I said in that article. They're calling us illogical, but saying that if we took the positions that they hold, which conflict among themselves because they hold this dichotomized view, and if we were logical, which means if they were logical as well, they would end up at 70 AD. And so he said it was only after he listened to them and heard all the confusion in that camp and the poor job at exegesis that they were doing with the scriptures that he came over and started listening to us and just opened up his world even more. Now,
that is
that.
Absolutely awesome. I can't top that, so I won't try. But that is absolutely wonderful. By the way, speaking of that article, William, to whom shall we go? Do you have that in a regular document form?
I do.
You sent it to me, PDF. I cannot seem to copy it into a regular document form to where I can publish it on my websites.
Yeah, I have it. I retyped the whole thing, and I can send it to you because I
appreciate that.
I actually found it at the Harding Graduate Library.
Awesome. Well, folks, we were joking here a moment ago about how awesome it is, but it truly is a fantastic article. There's no question about it whatsoever. What William Bell did is he went to the writings of prominent members of the Churches of Christ, as he's already suggested slightly, and that is on verses in which these very prominent, highly respected ministers in the Churches of Christ took positions on some of these key texts and posited their fulfillment at AD 70. And what he did was he just put them side by side and pointed out how if you were consistent and if you were logical, as even our adversaries are saying, if you followed their logic, you wind up as a true preterist. And so it's just absolutely remarkable. I can't wait for William to send that article to me. I will post it on all of my websites for everyone to see, not just members of the Church of Christ, because, folks, this doesn't happen just in the Churches of Christ, okay? I wrote an article entitled Gentry v. Gentry. It's now, I posted it on my DonKPreston.com website. You can go there and read it. And I pointed out how Dr. Kenneth Gentry has completely and totally entrapped himself. Now, here's what I mean, and this will be in a nutshell. Gentry takes the historical creedal view that the salvation of, quote, all Israel, unquote, in Romans 11, 25 to 27, does not take place until the end of the current Christian age at the coming of the Lord. That's the end of human history. However, in an article attempting to refute preterism, he took note of how preterists appealed to Luke 21:22, where Jesus said, "These be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled." Gentry made a grammatical point from the Greek, pointing out that the literal meaning, the literal translation of the text, These be the days of vengeance in which all things having been written. In other words, Gentry said what Jesus was referring to here was all Old Covenant prophecy would be fulfilled by AD 70. I pointed out, therefore, in the article, Gentry says all Old Covenant prophecy would be fulfilled by AD 70. But the salvation of Israel, all Israel, in Romans 11:25-27, is based upon Isaiah 27, Isaiah 59, Jeremiah 31, i.e. Old Covenant prophecies. Therefore, the salvation of Israel at the coming of the Lord, the second coming, was fulfilled no later than AD 70. Now, I posted that article, and I posted a link to it on my Facebook. And person after person after person posted in response saying, Kenneth Gentry and his writings led me to the true preterist view because of its consistency. Now, that has been said, William, you and I know it, others know it. The writings of Kenneth Gentry, the writings of Gary DeMar, the writings of Joel McDermott, the writings of Keith Matheson, the writings of these partial preterists, postmillennial dominionists, when followed logically, leads directly to covenant eschatology. And yet when people say that, people who have read their writings, who have wound up becoming full preterists, when these men are appointed to this reality, oh, well, that's just not true. It's just not true at all. Well, yes, it is. That's what these people are openly stating. That's why they became full preterists. The hermeneutic that you set out, Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, Joel McDermott, your own hermeneutic leads people to covenant eschatology. So, again, it's not true just of the Churches of Christ ministers in their hermeneutic that they set forth in their writings. It's true of others as well who give a good, solid, logical hermeneutic that leads people to where we are, and then they holler and they scream and they object because people follow their own hermeneutic to its logical conclusion. Absolutely fascinating what is going on.
That's for sure. All right.
Okay.
We have part two.
Yes, part two in response to Gene Hill and his presentation on the establishment of the kingdom. I got to tell you, folks, I was almost stunned when Gene Hill, early into his presentation, to refute covenant eschatology, appealed to Daniel chapter 9:24. And he made the comment, to paraphrase his statements, but to give the gist of what he said, Daniel 9:24, in its fulfillment, would be the full establishment of the kingdom. Then he turned right around, William, and astonishingly so, although it's fairly common, he made the claim that every element of Daniel 9:24 was fulfilled at the time of the cross. William, give us about 50 words or less, your initial response to that.
Wow. How about that?
Well, that's pretty good. It may not be definitive, but it's pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for the holy city to finish the transgression, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to anoint the most holy, to seal up vision and prophecy, etc. What did I miss?
To bring in everlasting righteousness and to anoint the most holy.
Righteousness, yes, and to anoint the most holy. And all of that happened in 30 A.D. And yet, he said in the speech that I listened to, that was the wrong one, that those prophecies were fulfilled in 70 A.D. So he has a serious problem in terms of his dichotomization, his duality on the fulfillment of Daniel. And yet, they don't seem to recognize it.
You know, what you pointed out there, William, is also true in this first presentation that he gave. He vacillated wildly on the one hand claiming the fulfillment of Daniel 9:24, and then turning around and saying that Daniel's 70 weeks were fulfilled in AD 70 in the fall of Jerusalem, Daniel 9:27. And you're going, wait a minute. What did you just say? You just said these constituent elements were fulfilled at the cross, and then you turn right around and say that Daniel 9 was fulfilled in AD 70. That is just a really, really, pardon me, strange dichotomization of the text itself. As you quoted it there, 70 weeks are determined on your people and your city. I mean, how do you then turn around and say that these 6 constituent elements, which are directly related to the people in the city, were fulfilled at the cross, and yet the fate of the people in the city is not fulfilled until AD 70? And by the way, William, you and I both know, now, he did not mention it in this lesson that I listened to, but you and I both know that so many of the men on that dais point at preterists and say, these men have a problem with the gap between the 69th and the 70th week, or they have a gap between Pentecost and AD 70. Well, again, Mr. Hill did not mention that. But if he has a problem with a gap in Daniel 9, then by saying, oh, wait, Daniel 9:24 was fulfilled at the cross, but Daniel 9:27, the completion of the 70 weeks, was fulfilled in AD 70. What has he done? What has he done? He's presented a gap.
That's right.
I mean, so
and
again,
not only will he do that,
I want to be fair. I'm not charging him personally with that, but many of the men on that dais have in the past charged preterists with a problem, saying, "Oh, you have to have a gap, et cetera, et cetera." Well, okay, I don't know, and again, I want to be fair. I don't want to charge Mr. Hill with throwing that aspersive claim at preterists, but he has a gap in his explanation of Daniel 9:24-27. So go ahead, William.
No, I'll just hold it for now, because basically I was going to say, some of them claim that we have a gap, and then when they go in and interpret Daniel, they will take some of the passages like Daniel chapter 7, which, by the way, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, and Daniel 12 all teach the same time of the end. So
absolutely.
By that point, if they claim that we have a gap, they have a universe between Daniel 2 and Daniel and the fulfillment, because they believe some parts of Daniel are not yet fulfilled to this very day.
Well, as a classic example, Wayne Jackson, who of course is now getting on up there in years, but he has been an outspoken critic of covenant eschatology. He wrote an article on the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. And he said the little horn is the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy, and said that the papacy is not destroyed until the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, folks, I wrote some articles in response to Wayne Jackson's little horn. They can be found on my website, eschatology.org. But the position that Wayne Jackson took puts him in the position, and
you're fading out on me, Don. I hope everybody else can still hear you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, looks like Don has dropped off. He's back. Okay, here we are. I didn't know that he was gone, but I know I couldn't hear him.
Yeah, I was sitting there talking away, and I happened to look at my screen, and it came up and said I'd been disconnected. So anyway, the point that we were making is that, as William well stated, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 12, all have the same eschatological terminal point, and that's AD 70. And yet here these men who accuse us of having a gap in Daniel 9 interject so far 2,000 years in their eschatological narrative. That's hardly a consistent theology to hold. But William, when we look at Daniel 9:24, and I mean, obviously we could spend weeks and weeks and weeks discussing Daniel chapter 9:24, but how in the world can anyone say that Daniel 9:24 has been completely fulfilled? And let's just pick out a couple of things. The term or the phrase seal, vision, and prophecy has to do with, and I document this extensively from a wide variety of scholarship across the entire spectrum of eschatological paradigms, from amillennialists, postmillennialists, premillennialists, all of whom say and admit, after doing extensive linguistic and grammatical studies, that seal, vision, and prophecy refers to the cessation of the prophetic office through and by means of the fulfillment of all prophecy. Okay, so that means that 70 weeks were determined to fulfill all prophecy, bringing the prophetic office to its close. By the way, I want to share something right here, a real quick anecdote, William. Some years ago, my goodness, it's been a long time ago, probably 35 years ago, I attended a revival/gospel meeting in a little town called Meeker, Oklahoma. It's about 90 miles north of me, something like that. And the preacher was a highly esteemed professor in the Churches of Christ who at the time taught Hebrew and Greek at what at the time was called OCC, Oklahoma Christian College. He could read the Hebrew probably better than I can read English. His name was Hugo McCord. If you are a member of the Churches of Christ listening to this program, chances are very, very good that you remember that name. He was a wonderful man. I loved him a great deal. Had the opportunity to sit down with him with coffee on occasion and what have you. He held this gospel meeting, and considering him a friend as I did, I went up there and listened to him. And after the lesson, I'd been doing research into the meaning and definition of seal, vision, and prophecy. And I knew what scholarship was saying, the scholarship that I was finding. I knew that if what I was seeing and finding was valid and true, that there's no way for any futurist eschatology to be true. There's just simply no way for it to be true. Okay, so knowing of his prowess in the Hebrew, I went up to him after his lesson was over, after the service was over, and we had a real good small talk visit, etc. And I said, Brother McCord, I want to ask you a question. I said, I want you to tell me on Daniel 9:24, when it says 70 weeks are determined to seal up vision and prophecy, what does seal up vision and prophecy mean in the Hebrew? And to my absolute, utter amazement, he leaned down almost as if he was going to tell me a secret that he didn't want everyone else to hear. I'm not trying to read anything into it, but that's what he did. He leaned down and said into my ear, Don, it means the fulfillment of all prophecy and the end of the prophetic office. And I said, really?
Awesome.
And he goes, that is exactly what it means and nothing else. Well, I didn't say, but Brother McCord, do you know what you just said? I was so stunned. So I just said, well, thank you, Brother McCord. I appreciate that. I said, I've been doing a lot of study on this, and that's what I'm seeing in the commentators. He said, make no mistake, that's what it means. Okay. So here was one of the greatest Hebrew scholars in the Churches of Christ who admitted to me that seal up vision and prophecy was dealing with the fulfillment of all, not some, but all prophecy and the cessation of the prophetic office. Now, folks, if Brother Hugo McCord was right, and I have no reason whatsoever to believe that he was not right, based upon the additional research that I had done at the time, the additional research that I've been doing ever since then, because I haven't stopped doing research. Every single commentary that I have picked up, unless they take the position that it's just the fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel 9, which really doesn't help the view at all, but be that as it may, those who go extensively into the Hebrew confirm that assessment. Well, guess what, folks? All prophecy was not fulfilled at the cross. The prophetic office did not cease at the cross. So when Gene Hill gets up and says, 70 weeks are determined, and that was all fulfilled at the cross, he is flying in the face, number one, of the world's scholarship when it comes to the meaning of the language. Okay? We're not talking mere interpretation. We're not talking about theological interpretation. We're talking about linguistic definitions. And that takes on something entirely different. We have a right as Bible students to question a person's theology, do we not, William? But when we come to the lexical definitions of words, the grammar of a text that is verified by grammarians and lexicographers over and over and over and over and over again, then that's an entirely different thing. It's always disturbing to me when I'm talking with someone and I'm sharing with them what the lexicons say about the definition of a word and how widely attested the lexicographical evidence really is. And a person might say, well, I don't care what the lexicons say. I had a person in private email just recently tell me all of the lexicons are absolutely wrong. And, of course, his justification for that was, the Lord showed me what the true meaning of that is. Oh. So, contra the entire history of lexicography, contra the entire history of Greek linguistic study, the Lord showed you that all of that is wrong. I don't have time for that kind of nonsensical, purely emotional type of correspondence. It doesn't ring my bell like your phone is ringing there. Are you there, William?
I had to mute. I muted, so you won't hear that. I had to mute mine before the program. It's a good thing I did because it's been vibrating off of my hip ever since we started. So anyway, I just find it remarkable. And of course, what we've seen there with seal up vision prophecy doesn't even touch the term of to bring in everlasting righteousness. William, why don't you offer just a thought or two on that particular aspect of Daniel 9:24? Okay. Well, everlasting righteousness, of course, has to do with the new heavens and new earth. You've got a text both in Galatians as well as in 2 Peter 3. And while we understand that, righteousness comes through the gospel, and you have Jesus in the Beatitudes saying, blessed is he who hungers and thirsts after righteousness, for he should be filled. I know for a while is taught in his book, the Sermon on the Mount in the Civil State, that was a Pentecost pointer. But that's not correct. That is an eschatological text that focuses on the end time. And so after we have the gospel being preached per Romans 1:16, in the 5th chapter of Galatians in verse 5, Paul writes, for we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness, which is by faith. So there
long after Pentecost, at the time of the writing of Galatians, they were still talking about the hope of righteousness. So where is that hope fulfilled, since we only have one hope? And Paul said in Romans 8, we were saved in that hope. Well, in 2 Peter 3, he talks about the promise, quoting from Isaiah 65, the promise of the new heavens and new earth, which these gentlemen still believe has not yet arrived, most of them. And Peter says, we look for, according to his promise, we look for new heavens and a new earth wherein righteousness dwells. And so the fulfillment of that hope is within the new heavens and new earth. But when you put Galatians 5 back, as we quoted earlier, with it, that was a work that was being accomplished by the Spirit, by the eschatological Spirit that was poured out in the last days. So you've got the Holy Spirit tying it to the first century, and therefore the fulfillment of that, according to Daniel, being at the time of the city being destroyed, and bringing in that everlasting righteousness takes you right back to 70 A.D.
Well, in direct harmony with that, I would point out that Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4, 6 and following said, I'm ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Now, people take that in one of two different ways. It is the crown for being righteous, which there's no problem with that whatsoever, because Paul was certainly striving to be found righteous in Jesus Christ by faith. But it can also be taken in the sense that the true righteousness was to arrive and to be given as the crown at the consummation, which is what is found there in Galatians 5:5, as well as 2 Peter chapter 3. So again, there's no true dichotomy here. There's no question that Paul was striving to be righteous, that he was striving to be found in Christ, to be made conformable to his death, so that he might be made conformable to his resurrection, etc. But what we're trying to say here, folks, is that this righteousness, he is our righteousness, according to Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. So again, we're just absolutely not denying that reality, but it was an ongoing process to bring in the world of righteousness. And what we have to see here, folks, is that this is a contrast between the Old Covenant world and the New Covenant world.
Yeah, let me throw in one more text, Don, that I think is really critical and key.
Yes.
From Psalm, I think it's 17 and verse 15, David said he would be satisfied when he would awake with God's likeness. And then Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 34, which is a quote from Daniel 12 and Isaiah 26 as well. But he says, awake to righteousness and sin not, for some have not the knowledge of God. If a person really sits down and exegetes 1 Corinthians 15 properly, they will see that the resurrection is a resurrection to righteousness.
That's right.
And therefore, again, shows the hope and connects it right back to Daniel.
That's exactly right. That's a great point. I love Psalms chapter 17. It appears to me that it ties in directly with 1 John chapter 3 as well. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we shall be like him as he is. And here's David says, that I shall sleep, but I shall awake in his likeness. So there you have, and the likeness there is the likeness of righteousness. It's the likeness of holiness. And so let me return to the point that I was going to make a moment ago, and that is this hope of righteousness, the new heaven and new earth wherein dwells righteousness. That hope of righteousness of Galatians 5:5, the crown of righteousness of 2 Timothy chapter 4, must be seen in a contrast with the Old Covenant world. Paul said in Galatians chapter 3, 20 and 21, if a law could have been given that could have given life, now watch this, then verily righteousness would have been through the law. The law. And so Paul is setting forth here the contrast between the Old Covenant world that could not give righteousness. And because it could not give righteousness, it could not give life. Righteousness and life are being used almost synonymously here. And so he is contrasting, and his point in Galatians chapter 3, here is the law that could not bring life, it could not bring righteousness. They were kept under the law as a guardian until when? Until the faith should come, until the coming of the one who would bring righteousness by faith, the kind of faith of Abraham. You know, Abraham was declared what? Righteous through his faith. So this theme of righteousness in a contrast to the Old Covenant law, looking forward to the time in which righteousness would be, as it were, the order of the day under the faith, the system of faith, or justification by faith, as opposed to the law, which was a system of justification by works. And so to say, as Brother Hill did, oh, well, Daniel 9:24 was completely and totally fulfilled at the cross. That completely flies in the face of the fact that Paul and Peter were still looking for the arrival of the world of righteousness foretold by Daniel. And that's just a tremendously sad oversight. It basically denies an entire raft of scriptures found in the New Covenant which look forward to the arrival of the faith that would bring righteousness. And here's the ironic thing about this, ladies and gentlemen. You have to grasp this. Gene Hill, not one of the speakers on the Bellevue Church of Christ lectureship, not one of those speakers believe that the New Covenant world of Jesus Christ had been fully revealed either at the cross or on Pentecost. Not one of them believe that the New Covenant was completely delivered, completely revealed, completely confirmed at the cross or Pentecost. So if and since it is the New Covenant by which everlasting righteousness would be brought in, then how is it possible to say that Daniel 9:24 was fulfilled at the cross when Gene Hill, not one single speaker on the Bellevue Church of Christ believes that the New Covenant, which, to reiterate, is the source of righteousness and life, not one of them believe that the New Covenant had been delivered at the cross. They don't believe it was fully delivered at Pentecost. They talk against Preterist, and they say, oh, the church was fully formed on Pentecost, and yet they don't believe the church had elders or deacons on Pentecost. The church was perfect on Pentecost, but they don't believe the church was perfect on Pentecost because they point to the arrival of that which is perfect in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and the arrival of the, quote, perfect man, unquote, of Ephesians chapter 4 as still in the future from when Paul wrote Ephesians chapter 4. To reiterate then what we have said on many, many occasions in our review of these men on the Bellevue lectureship, they contradict themselves coming and going, up, down, and sideways. They seem to be making up so many of their arguments literally as they go along. The arguments are not well reasoned. They're certainly not exegetical. They're not based upon solid hermeneutic. They are not holistic. And by that I mean they do not take into consideration the entirety of the scriptural evidence. They go at a verse that sounds sort of kind of appealing. Oh, well, look at this. 70 weeks are determined to seal up vision and prophecy. Well, yeah, that meant to fulfill Daniel 9. Without realizing that Daniel 9:24 is, in the final analysis of it, as I demonstrate in my book, 70 weeks are determined for the resurrection, Daniel 9:24 was, in fact, a prediction of the resurrection. Not the resurrection of Jesus, although he was the first fruits. No, Daniel 9:24 was a prediction of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, of Daniel 12, of 1 Thessalonians 4. So when he says that Daniel 9:24 was fulfilled at the cross, my goodness, how shallow that really is in its failure to be holistic in its approach to Scripture. By the way, let's look at one more since we're running out of time here, and this is really important stuff. William, it says 70 weeks were determined to put away sin. Now, we both know, we both acknowledge, we both teach. Hebrews 9:26 says, now once at the end of the age, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. We do not deny in any way, shape, form, or fashion that the atoning death of Jesus is the entire foundation for the removal of sin. No one denies that. No one has hinted at that. But William, according to 1 Corinthians 15:54 and following, when would sin be finally conquered?
Well, sin is finally conquered when the law is fulfilled, and that is the time of the resurrection. That's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 55 through 57. And that's very, very clear in terms of the time that sin is completely done away. Because he says the sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. And even in the verses before, he talks about resurrection when he says this mortal must put on immortality, this corruptible must put on incorruption, etc. And he says, and when this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. And so he goes into the quote, quoting from Hosea 13 and verse 14, and in those two passages he quotes Isaiah 25 and 8, as well as Hosea 13 and 14, and applies them to the resurrection, and saying that the sting of death is sin, the strength of sin is the law. And that will take you right back to Hebrews 9:26 and through 28, because the context there is not consummated until it arrives at the return of Christ in verse 28. And, of course, all of those passages dovetail right back into Daniel 9, as you're stating.
Exactly right. And, what's interesting to me is that these men, such as Gene Hill, say, well, Christ put away sin at the cross, because that's what Hebrews 9:26 says. And yet they fail to consider the typological aspect of the context of Hebrews 9, which is what you were pointing there. The context of Hebrews 9 is the Day of Atonement. By the way, what does Daniel 9:24 say? 70 weeks are determined to make the atonement. It astounds me. It really honestly astounds me how people can be so narrow in their vision. I mentioned a while ago that the view of Gene Hill and those on the dais at the Bellevue lectures are atomistic. And by atomistic, I mean they try to take a single text, a single phrase, and they do not look at it in its context. They do not take it in the context of proper exegesis. They do not consider it from a holistic perspective. What does the totality of Scripture have to say about this term, about this concept, about this motif. So this putting away of sin most assuredly is confined to the 70 weeks. From a holistic approach, absolutely Hebrews 9:26 has to be considered. It is part and parcel, but we cannot isolate that from Paul's discussion of putting away sin in 1 Corinthians 15. So here is Paul. I do take Hebrews as Pauline in its authorship. So here is Paul talking about the putting away of sin through the power of the death of Christ. That's a given, that is foundational, that is undeniable. And yet the same writer, accepting that Pauline authorship of Hebrews, that same author said that sin would be definitively put away, finally put away, at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Because sin, the sting of death, would be removed when the law, which was the strength of sin, was removed. Now, if and since Hebrews chapter 9 is talking about the putting away of sin, and since 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about the putting away of sin, and since they both speak of different points of time, and they both speak of different events related to the putting away of sin, then the logical, the necessary view is to say Hebrews 9:26 is talking about the initiation of the process of putting away of sin. 1 Corinthians 15, which speaks of an event subsequent to Hebrews 9:26, i.e. the death of Jesus, but it speaks of the putting away of sin nonetheless, which is the same motif as Hebrews 9:26. It absolutely demands that 1 Corinthians 15 is the consummation of what would be initiated and what was initiated by Jesus' death on the cross. We cannot take this atomistic approach, which so very often is so incredibly based upon presupposition. It's not based upon exegesis. It's based upon presupposition. And people say, oh, if you say sin is not put away until the resurrection, you're denying the power of the cross. Really? Maybe let's turn that around. William, answer this question for me and see if this is a legitimate question. If it denies the power of the cross to say that sin would not be finally put away with at the resurrection, does it deny the power of the resurrection to deny or to say that sin was put away at the cross? Does that not negate the power of resurrection?
Yes, absolutely.
So we dare not negate the power of either one, but rather we combine both texts, one being initiation, one being the foundation and the source, and to reiterate, the power, the other being the consummation. And to me, that's the proper and the holistic way to approach this concept. And it completely and totally refutes the idea of Daniel 9:24 being fulfilled at the cross. I mean, when a person does a careful, analytical, exegetical examination of Daniel 9 with this holistic approach about what the rest of the Bible has to say, there's simply no way to say that Daniel 9 was fulfilled at the cross. Now, that being the case, William, since Gene Hill was appealing to Daniel chapter 9 and saying it was fulfilled at the cross, number one, that negates his view, does it not, that the kingdom was established on Pentecost. Because if Daniel 9 is about the establishment of the church, and he says it was fulfilled at the cross, then does it mean that the kingdom was established at the cross? Is there something wrong with that argument?
Repeat that one, Don. You lost me.
Okay.
In the middle of it.
Gene Hill says that Daniel 9 is about the establishment of the kingdom. Daniel 9:24.
Right.
Gene Hill said Daniel 9:24 was all fulfilled at the cross. Does that not demand that the kingdom was established on the cross?
Oh, absolutely.
So there goes his claim that the kingdom was established on Pentecost.
Right, because
and yet,
you can't.
People were sitting in the audience going, "Amen, brother, preach it, amen, amen." Well, folks, you just destroyed your own AD 30 doctrine of Pentecost. It's rather amazing the self-contradictions that people fall into when they're seeking so desperately to refute a doctrine about which they know so very little. And as we have pointed out on this program repeatedly, folks, and I will say this just as kindly as possible, the men on the dais of the Bellevue Church of Christ lectureship more than obviously had not done their homework. They had not read the literature produced by true preterists. They have read, as we pointed out repeatedly, they've read the material of Wayne Jackson, of Curtis Cates, of Terry Varner. They haven't looked anything beyond that. They've looked at those men as men who seemingly understand covenant eschatology, and yet those men are some of the worst in the world in their abuse or in their knowledge or lack thereof of covenant eschatology. And so these men are following in the gross error of misrepresenting preterists and what we ostensibly believe. So they get up there in their boldness, and so very, very often, in their arrogance that just seem to spill out of every sentence, claiming that we are the ones ignorant of Scripture, we are the ones ignorant of eschatology, and yet they repeatedly misrepresent what we say. They completely and totally overlook the emphatic and the explicit statements of the biblical text, all the while proclaiming us as heretics. It's a sad state of affairs. It really is. And, William, we really do need to cover some more of what he had to say in regard to delivering up the kingdom, Matthew 25 and the judgment, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. So we'll do that next week. In the meantime, folks, I want to thank you so very, very much for joining us here on Fulfilled Radio, Two Guys and a Bible, a voice you can trust. Keep telling your friends, keep telling your neighbors about the program. Share it with them. Listen to it with them. And we'll see you again, Lord willing, next week. Good night, and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say, have a very pleasant day, and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.